In 1878, a carpenter named William Clark arrived in Tombstone, Arizona with a wagon full of lumber, a set of tools, and a skill that would prove far more valuable than he'd ever imagined. He could build coffins. Within 6 months, he'd built 47 of them. This is the story of the frontier town Undertaker, not the dignified mortician in a black suit you've seen in movies. This is the real story. The carpenter who built furniture during the day and coffins at night. The man who lived on the edge of every frontier community, essential yet avoided, prosperous yet isolated, handling death while the rest of the town tried to ignore it. Between 1860 and 1890, thousands of frontier towns sprang up across the American West. And in every single one, before there was a church, before there was a school, before there was even a proper sheriff, there was someone willing to bury the dead. Because on the frontier, death didn't wait for civilization to catch up. In most frontier towns, the undertaker wasn't really an undertaker at all. Not at first. He was a carpenter, or a cabinet maker, or a furniture builder who happened to have lumber, tools, and the skills to construct a 6-sided box on short notice. The logic was simple. A man who could build a kitchen table could build a coffin. The techniques were nearly identical. Measure, cut, join, finish. The only difference was the final customer couldn't complain about the craftsmanship. So when someone passed in a frontier settlement, the townspeople turned to whoever had wood and knew how to work it. That man became the de facto undertaker, whether he wanted the job or not. And here's what nobody tells you. Most of them didn't want it. The undertaking business carried a social stigma that followed a man everywhere he went. People crossed the street to avoid him. Women wouldn't let their children play near his shop. Saloon patrons fell silent when he walked through the door, as if death itself had entered the room. One undertaker in Kansas described it perfectly. "I am shunned by the living for my association with the deceased. My presence reminds them of their own mortality, and they resent me for it." But the same people who avoided him during the day would knock on his door at night, desperate, begging him to come quickly because a loved one had passed and the body was already beginning to change. On the frontier, bodies decomposed fast, especially in summer, especially in places like Arizona and Texas, where temperatures could hit 110 degrees by noon. Without refrigeration, without embalming chemicals, a body might have 24 to 48 hours before decay became unbearable. In extreme heat, that window could shrink to 12 hours. This meant the undertaker worked on a brutal schedule. A knock at 3 in the morning wasn't unusual. A family would arrive at his shop in tears, sometimes with the body already in their wagon, desperate for him to work immediately. And he would, because that was the job. The undertaker would take measurements, height, shoulder width, depth, right there in his shop or sometimes in the family's home. Then he'd select lumber. Pine was most common, cheap, and abundant. For wealthier families, he might use oak or even mahogany if he had it in stock. The coffin itself was a simple hexagonal or rectangular box. The traditional 6-sided coffin, wider at the shoulders, narrower at the feet, saved lumber and fit the human form more closely. But it required more skill to build, with angled cuts and complex joints. He'd work through the night, sawing, planing, joining the boards. A simple pine coffin took 4 to 6 hours to build from scratch. The work had to be precise. If the joints weren't tight, fluids would leak through during transport. If the lid didn't fit properly, the smell would escape. The undertaker worked methodically, his hands moving through practiced motions even in lamplight. Cut the headboard. Cut the footboard, cut the side panels, join them with dovetails or simple butt joints, depending on what the family could afford. Sand the interior smooth so fabric lining, if requested, wouldn't catch and tear. Attach the handles, usually simple rope or metal rings. Most frontier coffins had no viewing window, no elaborate decoration. Those fancy metallic burial cases with glass panels, advertised heavily in Eastern newspapers, rarely made it to frontier towns. Shipping costs made them prohibitively expensive, and besides, most frontier families couldn't afford a $60 to $100 casket when a $12 pine box would serve the same purpose. By dawn, the coffin would be ready, unadorned, functional, built to last just long enough to get the body into the ground. Then came the body preparation. The family usually handled washing and dressing their deceased if they were able, but sometimes they couldn't. Sometimes the body had been outdoors for days before discovery. Sometimes the manner of passing made the task too grim for family members to bear. That's when the undertaker stepped in. He'd clean the body as best he could, close the eyes, position the hands. In cases of violent passing, he might need to set broken bones so the body would fit properly in the coffin. If the deceased had passed from a gunshot wound, he'd plug the wound with cloth to prevent leakage. This was delicate work, performed with whatever tools were available. There was no formal training, no manuals to consult. The undertaker learned by doing, and each body presented new challenges. Women's groups in many frontier towns formed societies specifically for laying out the dead, washing, dressing, and preparing bodies for burial. These women provided a crucial service, especially for female deceased and children. But they too carried the social stigma. Death workers were death workers, regardless of gender. The undertaker coordinated with these women when they were available. When they weren't, and in many small frontier settlements they weren't, he did it all himself. The economics of frontier undertaking were strange and surprisingly profitable, if you could stomach the work. A simple pine coffin cost the family between $5 and $15 in the 1870s, depending on size and location. That might not sound like much, but consider, a cowboy earned $25 to $40 per month. A pine coffin represented half a week's wages for a working man. The undertaker's material costs were minimal. Rough lumber ran about $2 to $3. Add nails, maybe some cloth lining if the family requested it, and his total investment might be $4. That's a profit of $6 to $11 per coffin, excellent margins for frontier business. For wealthier families, the prices skyrocketed. An oak casket could cost $35. A mahogany casket with brass handles and satin lining, rare on the frontier but occasionally shipped from the east, could run $75 to $100. That was 3 months' wages for a laborer. But here's the reality. Most frontier undertakers didn't get rich from coffins alone. The real money came from providing complete funeral services. A typical bill in the 1870s might include a coffin for $12, $3 for preparing the body, $5 for hearse rental or a wagon draped in black cloth, $3 to $5 for grave digging depending on soil conditions, and $2 for attendance services like dressing the body and arranging flowers. Total, $25 to $30 for a modest funeral. Double that for a prominent citizen. In a town like Tombstone during its boom years, 1879 to 1883, with a population of 10,000 and dozens passing every month from gunshots, mining accidents, disease, and simple bad luck, an undertaker could clear $2,000 to $3,000 annually. That's more than most store owners and significantly more than miners who worked underground for $3 a day. But there was a catch. Actually, several catches. First, you had to live with the social isolation. Second, you had to expose yourself to disease. Third, you had to work irregular hours. Death kept no schedule. And fourth, you had to dig graves. Grave digging was brutal work. Frontier soil wasn't the soft earth of established cemeteries back east. It was hard-packed caliche in Arizona, rocky clay in Montana, frozen solid 6 months a year in Colorado. Boot Hill cemeteries got their name partly because so many graves were dug shallow, 3 or 4 feet deep instead of the traditional 6 feet. Why? Because the ground was simply too hard to dig deeper without machinery that didn't exist yet. In Pioche, Nevada, the Boot Hill Cemetery became infamous for graves so shallow that the dead men's boots supposedly stuck up out of the ground. Whether that's literal truth or frontier exaggeration doesn't matter. The fact is, graves were dug as deep as the undertaker could manage in the time he had, and that often wasn't very deep. One undertaker in Deadwood described spending an entire summer day digging a single grave through rocky soil. He charged the family $15 just for the digging, 3 times the normal rate. They paid it. What choice did they have? In many frontier cemeteries, you can still see the evidence of this desperate shallow burial practice. Wooden markers rotted away quickly, often within 5 years in harsh frontier weather. Rain, snow, sun, and wind destroyed them. Grave robbers and souvenir hunters took them. Animals scattered them. The result? Boot hills across the West are filled with unmarked graves, unknown bodies, forgotten names. Tombstone's Boot Hill holds an estimated 300 burials, but only about 200 can be identified today. The rest are simply gone, lost to time, weather, and the harsh reality that frontier undertakers were building for immediate necessity, not long-term preservation. The graves themselves tell stories if you know how to read them. Wooden headboards, simple crosses, piles of rocks to mark the spot and prevent animals from digging up the remains. Occasional iron fencing around family plots for those who could afford it. The epitaphs, when they existed, were often darkly humorous. Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no les, no more. George Johnson, hanged by mistake. John Heath, taken from county jail and lynched by Bisbee mob. These weren't added by the undertaker. They were commissioned by friends, enemies, or simply people with a grim sense of humor. The undertaker just dug the hole and filled it in, and he dug a lot of holes. In Tombstone, during the boom years, 1879 to 1883, someone passed every few days on average. Gunshots, mining accidents, disease, simple bad luck. The cemetery filled rapidly. The undertaker worked in all weather. Summer heat above 100 degrees, winter cold that froze the ground solid, spring rains that turned the cemetery into mud. He dug graves when he was sick, when he was exhausted, when his back screamed in protest and his hands were covered in blisters, because the body was waiting and the body wouldn't wait long. Then there was the question of preservation. Before formaldehyde-based embalming became widespread in the 1880s, frontier families used whatever methods they could to delay decomposition long enough for a proper burial. The most common method, alcohol, specifically whiskey. Bodies were sometimes soaked in whiskey barrels. One story tells of a woman who preserved her husband's body in a tin casket filled with whiskey and kept him under her bed for several months before shipping him by train to Illinois for burial in the spring. Another preservation method, arsenic. About 3 pounds per body, either rubbed onto the skin or mixed with alcohol and applied as a solution. Arsenic was readily available. It was used as rat poison and in various medicines, but it was also highly toxic to anyone handling the body. The technique had come from the Civil War. Soldiers were passing on battlefields far from home, and their families wanted them returned for proper burial. This created an urgent need for preservation methods that could keep bodies intact for weeks-long journeys. Dr. Thomas Holmes, known as the father of modern embalming, claimed to have embalmed over 4,000 Union soldiers by war's end. He experimented with various chemical compounds, eventually developing safer alternatives to the earlier arsenic-based methods. But safer is relative. Even Holmes's improved formulas contained dangerous chemicals. And out on the frontier, far from medical schools and supply chains, undertakers used whatever preservation methods they could cobble together from available materials. Zinc chloride compounds, alcohol solutions, arsenic paste, even salt and ice when available, packed around the body in a sealed container to slow bacterial growth. None of it was pleasant work. The smell alone was overwhelming. The chemicals burned the skin. The risk of infection from handling decomposing bodies was constant and poorly understood. Undertakers exposed themselves to arsenic poisoning, to diseases like typhoid and diphtheria and consumption, to infections from handling bodies with open wounds. There was no concept of universal precautions, no rubber gloves, no understanding of germ theory in most frontier towns. They worked with their bare hands, they breathed the air of death, and they got sick. A lot. One study of undertakers from the 1880s found they had significantly higher rates of respiratory illness, skin conditions, and early mortality compared to other frontier professions. The average frontier undertaker lived to about 55 years old, not terrible by frontier standards, but notably shorter than carpenters who didn't handle bodies. The psychological toll was harder to measure, but just as real. Imagine building coffins for children, because that happened constantly on the frontier. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, accidents, children passed at horrifying rates. In some frontier towns, infant mortality ran as high as 30%. The undertaker would take measurements of a small body, build a small coffin, dig a small grave. Then he'd do it again the next week, and the next month, and the next year. One undertaker's journal from Wyoming in the 1870s records 43 burials in a single summer. 14 were children under the age of 5. He wrote simply, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, but it is I who must measure the taking." There was no therapy, no support groups, no one to talk to about the weight of handling so much death. The undertaker carried it alone, alongside the social stigma that kept him isolated from the community he served. But there were moments, rare moments, when the community acknowledged his essential role: the funeral procession. When a prominent citizen passed, the entire town might turn out for the burial. The undertaker would drape his wagon in black cloth, transforming it into a makeshift hearse. He'd drive slowly through the main street, the coffin visible in the wagon bed, while townspeople lined up to pay their respects. Behind the hearse walked the family. Behind them, the rest of the community. Business owners, miners, cowboys, saloon keepers, even the women who normally avoided the undertaker on the street. In those moments, his work became visible. The careful construction of the coffin, the respectful handling of the deceased, the dignity he brought to death in a place where death was often brutal and sudden. One undertaker in Montana described such a procession in his journal. 300 souls walked behind the wagon today. They wouldn't shake my hand yesterday. They won't shake it tomorrow. But today, they followed where I led. Today they needed me to show them how to honor the dead. This is the only thanks I will ever receive. The procession would wind up to the cemetery, usually on a hill overlooking the town, as if the dead were watching over the living. There, the undertaker and hired laborers would lower the coffin into the ground using ropes. A preacher would say words if one was available. If not, someone from the community would speak. Then, the filling of the grave. Shovel by shovel, the earth returned. The undertaker usually stayed until the work was complete, ensuring the grave was properly filled and mounted to account for settling. Finally, the marker. A wooden cross or headboard, painted or carved with the deceased's name and dates if known, often just unknown or died 1882. The markers were crude, temporary, expected to last a few years at most before weather destroyed them. And then everyone would leave. The family, the community, the preacher. The undertaker would be the last one standing at the grave, alone again, ready to return to his shop and his furniture making, until the next knock came at his door in the middle of the night. And yet, despite everything, the stigma, the disease exposure, the irregular hours, the psychological burden, there was never a shortage of men willing to do the work. Why? Because the money was good, because the work was steady, because death was the one guaranteed commodity on the frontier. As embalming technology advanced in the 1880s and 1890s, the undertaking profession began to professionalize. The simple carpenter-undertaker evolved into the mortician, trained in chemical preservation, restoration, and funeral direction. Formaldehyde, discovered in 1859 by Russian chemist Alexander Butlerov, became the standard embalming fluid by the 1890s. It was far more effective than alcohol or arsenic, though it came with its own dangers. Prolonged exposure caused lung cancer, bronchitis, and respiratory failure in the undertakers who used it. But it worked. Bodies could be preserved for days, even weeks. This allowed for more elaborate funerals, for family members to travel long distances to attend, for the entire funeral industry to slow down and become more ceremonial. The term undertaker itself began to disappear. At the 1882 meeting of the Funeral Directors National Association, it was decided that funeral director sounded more professional, more respectable, less associated with the grim labor of earlier decades. By 1900, undertaking had become a legitimate profession with training schools, professional associations, and standardized practices. The stigma began to fade, slowly, but it faded. But back in those early frontier years, 1860 through 1885, the undertaker was something different. He was a practical tradesman handling society's most fundamental need, the disposal of the dead. He wasn't dignified, he wasn't respected, he certainly wasn't celebrated. He was necessary. In Tombstone, Boot Hill Graveyard was used from 1878 to 1884. Over 300 people were buried there in those 6 years. Most passed from violence, gunshots, stabbings, hangings, others from disease, accidents, natural causes. Every single one of them passed through the hands of an undertaker, someone who measured them, built their coffin, prepared their body, dug their grave, and lowered them into the hard desert ground. The wooden grave markers rotted away within a few years. The names were forgotten. The graves were lost. When restoration efforts began in the 1920s, only about half the burials could still be identified. But the undertakers did their work anyway. Not for recognition, not for gratitude, not for friendship or social standing, for money, yes, but also because someone had to do it.